Well, good afternoon, and it's fantastic to be here in Zurich with so many like-minded people. What I want to talk to you about today is about our vision for the West and for Europe and for Britain. And it was Tolstoy who said or wrote, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." And he wasn't talking about the Beckhams at the time. Yeah, but I think the same is true of countries. When you look at happy countries, what do they have? They have freedom. They have the importance of a sovereign nation state. They have Christian values. They have the family as the bedrock of society. And what we've seen over the past 50 years in Western Europe, but also in America, also across the Anglosphere in Australia and Canada, is an active attack on those values that made our countries successful, that made them great, and that made the people in those countries happy. And I've been a witness to this during my time in British politics. I was first elected in 2010 as a member of parliament. And at the time when I was elected, I've always been a free marketeer. I've always been skeptical of big government. I've been skeptical of organizations like the European Union. But I did not understand how bad it was. I did not understand how deep the rot went. I thought it could be fixed. I thought if I simply served my time in each government ministry, tried to do the right thing, that by getting more senior, I would be able to exert more influence and therefore change the policies. And I have come to understand that what has been going on in our countries and internationally is the advancement of an ideology that is fundamentally anti the very values that we hold dear. It is self-defeating and it is almost self-loathing. George Orwell talked about there was always an element of the British intellectual elite that hated Britain. But those people are now in power. And they're not just in power in Parliament, and clearly Keir Starmer is of that ilk. They're also prominent in our bureaucracies. They started to dominate our universities. They are even active now in private corporations who typically lobby for more government favours. And the ideologies that they support, one of them is Marxist and neo-Marxist economics. Another is Islamism, and we have a problem in Britain with the appeasement of Islamism. But also, it is the climate change extremism. It is the idea that the most important thing is reducing carbon, reducing the footprint on the planet, really is a tool of being able to control people. That's what it is ultimately about. And what we've seen really, and it's since the election of Tony Blair in Britain, I think you saw similar things really under Clinton and Obama. In America, you've seen similar trends in the EU. But we saw the implementation of those policies into the law so that the system wasn't just there to implement the will of the government of the day. It was actually part of implementing these policies. New laws were passed, such as the Human Rights Act, the Constitutional Reform Act, the Climate Change Act 2008, that established a climate change committee of technocrats that essentially dictated what Britain's energy policy was. We saw the judiciary undermined with the Constitutional Reform Act. So what we saw is a whole series of laws passed in Britain, a whole series of institutions created, and a whole series of placemen put in those institutions who couldn't be removed. Another example, of course, is the Bank of England. I'll come on to them in a minute because they play a key role in what happened in 2022. But essentially what you had was unelected bureaucrats usurping the power that used to be held by Parliament. And those unelected bureaucrats had a particular set of policies and ideologies that they followed. And those ideologies were essentially neo-Marxist, postmodernist ideologies. And the British elite, rather than worrying about the condition of people in Britain and issues like economic growth, were more worried about following these ideological trends. And of course, they were supported by organizations like the World Economic Forum, with other international institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank. The ideology was not just in Britain, it was right across an international network. And there was a whole series of things that it was acceptable to think. And we've seen the results of this. We've seen the results of these policies for the last 30 years. So in the year 2000, Britain was almost catching up with America in terms of our GDP per capita. Now, American GDP per capita is 50% higher in America than it is in Britain. Britain is now poorer per capita than Mississippi, which is the poorest US state. And some people say that if you take London out, we're poorer than Puerto Rico. And we are about to be overtaken by some of the now successful former communist countries, such as Poland, because they are adopting the self-defeating policies that we've adopted in Britain. And probably of all of the policies, the most self-defeating has been the net zero policy. I mentioned the 2008 Climate Change Act. Well, under the Conservative government, I would say so-called Conservative government, under Theresa May, those regulations were tightened to get to net zero by 2050. And that has had a dramatic effect on the oil and gas industry. It's had a dramatic effect on the cost of energy. Britain now has the highest cost of energy in the developed world. And the result is car plants have closed down. We're no longer producing our own virgin steel. I think we're the only G7 country that doesn't produce our own steel anymore. We've seen communities like the mining community affected. We've seen oil and gas in the North Sea virtually stop. And of course, we've seen economic stagnation. I mean, people's living standards have not really risen for the past 30 years. And just to give you a bit of my background, I actually started my career in the oil industry, working for Shell in liquid natural gas shipping. And I understand how important oil and gas is to geopolitics. It's obvious. And this is something that President Trump is now leveraging in terms of what is happening across the world. And Britain and Europe have been completely caught napping. At the same time as oil and gas has got more important, we have indulged in completely self-defeating policies to essentially cancel this real bedrock of our economies and our societies. So back to 2022, I'd spent 10 years in various different government departments. The Environment Department, the Treasury, where one of the things I tried to do was stop COP26 happening in Britain. Unfortunately, it was defeated because too many of my cabinet colleagues were busy hugging Greta Thunberg. And I'm serious about what they were doing rather than concern. I mean, we just left the European Union, and I thought, even if you believed in climate change ideology, surely the priority should be getting a good Brexit deal and negotiating trade deals with the rest of the world, not hosting a hot air festival in Glasgow. But I lost that argument. And in fact, I ended up as foreign secretary when COP was on, having to deal with Joe Biden. So I think I have I have done my penance. So I've done my time. But in 2022, and I won't go, you can read my book, 10 Years to Save the West, where I go through the whole gritty history of exactly what happened in the Conservative Party. And James referred to that. But essentially, we were in serious trouble. Boris Johnson, who'd been elected in 2019, and he'd been elected because people wanted change. He was boosterish. He was saying things are going to get better in the British economy. I'm going to deliver Brexit. And huge numbers of voters who previously voted Labour in the former industrial parts of Britain thought, we want something different. We're going to vote for Boris Johnson. He was deposed by various miscreants within the Conservative Party. You can read about it in my book. And the vacancy became open. And at the time, I had a choice. I knew this would be very, very tough. I knew that Boris had been deposed and that the people who were pulling the strings in the Conservative Party wanted Rishi Sunak to become Prime Minister. But I also knew Rishi Sunak was the man who'd put corporation tax up to 25%, who'd invented a new health and social care tax, who put a windfall tax on the oil and gas industry. And I thought, what is the point of getting elected as a member of parliament and serving as a government minister and doing my time sorting out everything from prison riots to floods? And I managed to get the worst prison riots when I was in the Justice Department since the 1990s and the worst floods since the 1950s when I was in the Environment Department. So I thought, what's the point of doing all that if I'm not going to try and change the direction this country is going and this party is going? And that is why I put myself forward. And it was a last-minute campaign. I was actually in Bali at a G20 foreign ministers meeting where it popped up on TV that Boris had resigned. So it took me 18 hours to get back to Britain. I had to start the campaign. But what I said is we've got to change what we're doing. We've got to take on woke ideology. We've got to be clear that men are men and women are women. And we've got to sort out issues like immigration. And I said the most crucial priority initially is to get economic growth going. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow fracking in the United Kingdom, which had been banned. And Britain could be self-sufficient on gas if we allowed fracking, according to the geological studies that are being conducted. We could become a net energy exporter. And that was my plan. That's what I thought would completely transform Britain's economic fortunes. And I said, we've got to reverse this raise in corporation tax. We've got to get rid of all these other taxes that are stopping people invest in this country, whether it's IR35, whether it's VAT, VAT relief on duty-free shopping. We had all these taxes that were just stopping people visiting our country. They were stopping people investing in our country. I mean, people just didn't want to go out to work the extra hour because the tax system at particular points was just so counterproductive. So we put forward, I have got elected on this manifesto because there are, although Conservative MPs are not the most Conservative people in Britain, the Conservative members were. So they voted for me and I got through. We put in place these policies. And what happened? Well, what happened was the weekend after the mini budget, there started to be all these fluctuations in the market. And what happened was, and it later turned out, that this was caused by the Bank of England's failure to regulate pensions. So the Bank of England in 2024 admitted that 2/3 of all of that market movement in 2022 was down to their failure to regulate pensions and essentially allow the pension industry to bet that interest rates were going to be low forever. And what they also did is the night before the mini budget, they suddenly started a quantitative tightening program. So they announced the sale of £40 billion worth of government gilts for the first time in years. So you had this situation which was caused by the Bank of England. By the way, the Bank of England is committed to net zero ideology. The Bank of England governor is unsackable. The previous Bank of England governor, as everybody knows, who set a lot of these policies in train, was Mark Carney, who is now the Prime Minister of Canada and a regular at the World Economic Forum. So they did not like what I was trying to do, because I was trying to take on their policies. I was trying to get them to change monetary policy, which I thought as Prime Minister I should be able to do, as I was the one with the democratic mandate. But what happened was, at the time, they pointed the finger at me. They said, it's Liz Truss's mini budget that's caused all this. Gleefully, various Conservative MPs joined them. The entire mainstream media in Britain, like the BBC, revved it up. So even though the announcements I made were actually not as big as some of the spending announcement Rachel Reeves has made, or indeed the spending announcement Rishi Sunak made during COVID, they essentially just mounted a huge pile on me. And ultimately, in a prime ministerial system, MPs can get rid of the sitting prime minister, and that is, they put a gun to my head, and that's what happened. Lots of people ask me, would you have done something different? I said, well, what exactly could I have done differently apart from have a brain transplant into the 350 Conservative MPs that were in the House of Commons at the time, which I would have dearly loved to do, but didn't. But what I've learned from this whole experience, and this is important for anybody who gets elected in Britain in 2029, or I believe it's unlikely an election before then, is in order to change our countries now, it is much tougher, I believe, than it was in the 1980s, because we now have a radicalized bureaucracy. We essentially have people working at senior levels in the civil service, working at senior levels in organizations like the Bank of England, who do not agree with the principles I laid out at the start of this speech. They don't believe in freedom of speech, for starters, but they also don't believe in free market economics. They don't believe in supply side economics, and they don't want to say Britain is a Christian country. These are people with a particular ideological worldview. And essentially, those people have to be taken on. And I think we need to move to a system where we are able to appoint the people that we want to do the senior roles in government. I know it's extraordinary I'm saying that. Lots of people assume you can. Well, you can't. And that is one of the difficulties I had. So how is this going to be achieved? And the way I describe this in Britain is we're talking here about a counter-revolution. What Blair did was a revolution. Through things like the Constitutional Reform Act, through things like the Human Rights Act, through things like the Climate Change Act, he essentially mounted a revolution within our own country that put people in permanent positions of power that were anti-conservative views. That's what happened. And yes, there were lots of craven politicians between 2010 and 2024 who were in the Conservative Party, but it is also true that we were swimming against the tide. Now, what we should have done on day one is reverse all those laws. That's what we ought to have done in 2010. But even, as I said, when I was first elected in 2010, I didn't really get how bad it was. I didn't really understand the extent to which this web of laws that had been created that made it inevitable that the government did certain things, and also gave the civil servants huge power to decide what was legal, what was the truth. The extent to which power was handed from Parliament to unelected technocratic experts is massive. And ironically, Britain voted to leave the European Union, but I think people in Britain have found that the technocrats in the British bureaucracy are, if not quite as bad, pretty bad, and deeply embedded and networked. And I remember when I was Foreign Secretary, I found words of my speech had been changed. And I asked one of the officials, I said, have you been on the phone to the State Department? Turns out they had. And the Biden administration, the State Department was networked in with the British officials and the European officials. And that's the way it worked. And that's the way it still works in Britain, which I think explains some of what's going on over things like the Chagos Island and the Chinese embassy. We have a system now in Britain that is actually hostile to freedom and hostile to what we all want to see, which is sovereignty, prosperity, and success for our citizens. So how is this counter-revolution going to be started? Well, first of all, I think we need a media revolution. And that is why I have started my new show, The Liz Truss Show, to talk about what is going on in Britain, telling people the truth, whether it's about the fact that people have been banned from Britain because they have right-wing views, the fact that people have been jailed in Britain because they have tweeted. There was a woman called Lucy Connolly. She was on my show a few weeks ago. She was jailed for 18 months for posting on X. Actually, I think the full sentence was 31 months for posting on X. Absolutely astonishing. Something that we thought we would only see in Eastern Europe of old is now, it feels like it's happening in Britain. And what we need is to develop an independent media ecosystem to challenge the narrative that is coming not just out of the BBC, but out of a lot of the print press, also other news outlets too. The second thing we need to do is build a movement of people, and that's why I'm pleased to be here with the Heartland Institute today. We need a network of people across Britain, across Europe, connected in with the United States of America that believe in these values, because believe me, the other side have a huge networked blob. They're not too far away from us now. We know who they are, and we need to build that movement of people. And then finally, once people understand the truth, once they're prepared to vote for leadership who do actually want to change things, the change actually has to be achieved. And that is going to be the most almighty battle. And we can see that battle going on in the United States. The court cases, the lawfare, the leaking from within institutions, that will all happen in Britain too. And these people are getting ready for it. They know that their current positions are threatened. They know that Keir Starmer is the most unpopular prime minister in British history. I think he's probably the most unpopular leader since King John, and you remember that King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta because he had taken such liberties and had all sorts of unfair taxes put in place. And I think Keir Starmer is his spiritual legacy in Britain. But that is the situation we face. So despite the dire situation, and we get a lot of sympathy from people overseas about what's happening in Britain, despite the dire situation in our country, I do believe that the public is on the side of change. I know that's what they want. So they were prepared to vote for Brexit. They voted for Boris on the promise of change. They are ready and waiting for things to happen. So all my final words are, please help us deliver that change in Britain, because I think it will also help other movements around Europe, and it will help strengthen what is happening in America as well, because we are all on the same side and our enemies are all on the other side.